I'm here with James Felton Keith, who is a serial entrepreneur and president of the Data Union. James, you have just been talking at the conference today about data and in particular the value of data. So what are your thoughts around that?
Well, first, thank you for having me. I think the value of data is immense. And too often at data protection conferences or policy conferences, we're talking about data privacy, which is first off not the same thing as protection. But also, I think there's a sort of higher issue that we're not talking about, which is the fact that data is integral to every business process, every product that we make, every process that we make. And as it is, the most interesting argument, I think, to everyday individuals and really to companies who are seeking evaluation are the value of the inputs to their productivity. And to be clear, the way we identify the value of those inputs, or rather identify those inputs, is in data. So when I'm talking about data, I'm rarely talking about privacy, which is, again, what a lot of the advocates are here talking about at this conference, what a lot of the subject matter experts and industry vets are talking about at this conference. But I'm just not interested in it. I'm interested in how valuable my data is across the board. And I'm not just talking about it in social media, but I'm talking about my location data, my finance data, my insurance data, and the biggest piece is, I think, my healthcare data. So I think establishing that there is a real viable economic value for my data is important, and building it into the political lexicon is important so that people across the board start to understand not only that their privacy should be honored and protected, or that their agency should be honored and protected, but also that they should be valued. It's more of a human rights conversation around how valuable am I as the rigid person that I am, with all of my makeups, who I am, where I am, my gender, my race, my geographic location, my income class, my education class, all these things, what food I like, all of those, representation of all of those is a data point. I'm American, so someone asked me if I wanted a hamburger earlier today, but I went for the burrito bowl just because I felt like I needed to eat more rice in general, or at least my mother-in-law told me that, but that's a data point. And it's a value transferred from her to me, and it's manifested in a selection for rice. And so luckily, there was an institution here that was betting on that, and that is benefiting from that. So I am an input to their market data around how valuable that product is, rice, per us as consumers in this place and time. So I just care about the value of data. So I'm here to talk about that specifically and try to integrate it into all the other conversations that are happening around data protection in general in this new law. So, yeah.
It doesn't feel like there's an easy way to calculate the value of data. If I've got a database full of customers and it's good quality, how do I know what value that has compared to my competitor?
Sure. So it's not always easy. And I don't know that it's necessary to put a rigid value on every individual's head, but it is necessary to say that inputs from consumers and or inputs from employees is this volume in how we distribute the products and services that we have to consumers per employees. So we can say if we made $100 in revenues, we can calculate per that $100 in revenues, that's our productivity. That's not profits, that's our productivity. We can say of that productivity, what percentage of it was inputs from individuals inside and outside of our company. And we can derive what is owed. And so then there's a negotiation that should and can happen around how we distribute what is owed. As a data value advocate, I'm really advocating more so for inclusion, and more specifically economic inclusion. So I'm compelled to have these conversations, not because I'm just thinking about data and the protection of knowledge about your choices, but it's because I care about the scaling productivity of this economy based on what we know about your choices and our inability to distribute value from that productivity back to you. So if we look at the past 50 years, we've been 200 times as productive as a society than we were in the previous 50 years from an economic standpoint. But our ability to distribute wages has flatlined since 1973. It's almost 50 years. That's a big problem. I was born right after 1973, and it's a problem that no one has gotten a pay raise since then. Now, this is not a wage argument. It's an argument that because humans and their data and their decision making are the new inputs to our economic productivity, we have to look at income separately from wages to indemnify people for their participation, whether it's picking rice or anything else. And so the hard work is not about how much you're owed by some small company, which may be $1 or 5 cents or a pound, a euro, you name it. It's really about what is the collective owed from the productivity, and are we brave enough to distribute it well? And so that's the work that we're doing at the Data Union, is trying to ensure that we are brave enough to distribute that value well. And so we write laws and we advocate to academia and labor and politicians and business so that they all understand how to better distribute this resource, a natural resource that we would call your data. It naturally occurs. You exist in the world. We just happen to be tracking it now. And so it is a natural resource. So we want to distribute it better. But that would be how I would endeavor to calculate the value in that particular scenario. You'd be a part of a large pool of inputs. Yeah.
And do you see much difference between the US and the UK when it comes to data?
Well, yeah. So first things first is, so we got the GDPR passed a while ago, and it just started to be enforced this May. And I feel like the 21st century has finally started. So we just started May 25th, 21st century is here. The first 18 years, we're sort of nostalgic about what we did in the 90s. And I love the 90s. They were a good time. Love the music. But now that we are here, the difference between the EU and the US is you all have this new law that is really a catalyst for how we advocate for value across the board. And it's not about the cyber compliance rules that are written into the GDPR, but the GDPR has 3 unique human rights written into it that are now, if they didn't exist in a particular state before, have pervaded the world. The EU has essentially exported digital human rights to the rest of the world. And those rights are the right to erasure, which is like the right to be forgotten. The right to portability means you have a say over how your stuff moves. And the right to restrictive processing, which means you have the right to say stop. But those 3 together and how we would communicate it in the US are very specific to just outright ownership. So what we're saying is, from a digital standpoint, you have a right to agency over the digital representation of your personhood. And that is unprecedented. And so what we're hoping to do in the US from a policy standpoint is build on what you have with the GDPR to give people an outright right to ownership, because we think it's good for markets. So people can say, as this bucket of data exists, company by company, individual by individual, we can start to see it trade in the markets, we can start to see it scale, and we can start to see it actually indemnify people, pay for them to eat, pay for people's housing, their health care, their education, you name it. When we think about how to include people in the economy, I think in the near future, not the far future, it'll be a result of how we understand the evidence, which is data, of their participation in the economy. And so we'll have all sorts of new interesting arguments around discrimination, especially from a gender standpoint, from an ethnic standpoint, from a geolocation standpoint, from an economic standpoint, you name it, or based on whatever food you eat. So we differ in that you all have the law and we don't. But I think the next biggest difference is Americans are, I think, just per our legislative history and our litigative history, are more prone to want to negotiate about the value of anything, any asset. And data in a lot of cases can be identified as property or an asset. And so we want to keep that as a sort of staple of Americanism and allow people to be able to negotiate on their behalf. And so we're going to try to write laws that, number one, not only protect the individual, but empower the individual to go out and advocate on their behalf and say, hey, company X, you owe me. And you owe people like me. And pay us now or else. And the hope is, and I think there's a lot of empirical evidence that backs up this being a positive thing, is that we'll see the economy scale as a result, because we'll see more people included in it than we have right now. Because even as we are very productive, the vast majority of people are being regularly excluded from the economy as we automate how they participate from a wage standpoint. People can't really afford to participate in the economy anymore like they could in 1973. So that's the difference, and that's the work that we'll be doing, is sort of taking best practices, back and forth across the pond. So, yeah.
It feels like a big leap from comply, protect
It is a big leap.
Empower. How long do you think this sort of process would take?
I think a matter of months and years. Let's say the next 72 months. I think a sea change will happen. So Americans have been, myself included, participating in the writing of the GDPR since the beginning, since 10 years ago, 2009, 2010. Those when we started to see the first big data conferences pop up. Around 2011, folks were in Davos at the World Economic Forum calling data the new asset class, and people started to publish papers on it. It's really about how we think about a thing in caucus, in audience. Someone says something on a large stage, and then people start to go, that makes sense. The CEO of IBM right now is calling data a natural resource, and as she is doing that, it's changing how people think about the old adages, which were labor, property, asset class, you name it. Now that it's this naturally occurring thing, you start to think about infrastructure. So just as we use fossil fuels as a natural resource to create our road infrastructure, and it's a depreciating asset that we constantly reinvest in, we have to think about our societal infrastructure as a derivative of data. And as it is, we have to continue to reinvest in where we extract that data from, and that's us, so that the infrastructure of our society doesn't go awry. I think right now, even when we look at the political discourse, it's a result of people feeling distant from the developments that are happening in the world. And it's true. Productivity is taking off, but it's leaving everybody behind. Unless you own a company or you own a product, you don't really have any equity in the productivity. And so this is really, and the GDPR was the first step. Like, again, as Americans, we were at the table co-writing this legislation with all of these various commissions. It started with the Irish, moved to the Germans, and it moved sort of around the EU. But we're all coming together thinking, not only do we want to build out a compliance framework via the GDPR, but we also want to build out a human rights catapult so that we can start to talk about the value of this stuff over the long term. And it was really a compromise. Governments were looking at GDPR as, okay, we don't want the big tech companies to run amok. We need a way to tax them if they wrong the people, because we work for the people. So the GDPR allows them to do that. They take a big chunk out of your business if you do something wrong. But what we got as the data advocates on the back end was we got to write in these laws that enforce the compliance rules. So the only way to enforce a compliance rule, if you're a government, is by showing that you violated the government's constituents, which are individuals. So you have to write in those rights to, erasure, portability, and restrictive processing to say, well, you violated one of us, so now we have to retaliate. But it's a win-win. We're going in the right direction because on the heels of this GDPR, we'll start to just talk about the value. Like right now in the United States, for instance, and I think a lot of the EU, people generally care about privacy. They care about being violated, but it's not going to stop them from sharing information about themselves because better products and services are available. I like to think about just women in general. We see them in such a detailed yet pervasive way in 2018 than we did 20 years ago or 50 years ago. To be very crass, sometimes I give talks about the advertising that I see on New York subway around women's underwear. And they come in all these different colors, and they match all these different skin tones, and they come in all these different shapes. Whereas, forget 50 years ago when they all looked a certain way, 10 years ago, they were all one color. And so now that we see women as human beings with agency, with power in the world, who participate in the world, that need products and services to help them operate more comfortably, we're acknowledging that they're a piece of the productivity paradigm. But as they are now an input to how these products and services exist. They're owed a piece. And it's not the old trade-off that used to exist where if you're the maker of the product and I'm the buyer of the product, the value transfer is you send me the product and I send you the money and we're square. Because now I'm an input to your development of that productivity. So if you make a chair or if you make a brassiere and you sell it to me, so maybe I'm in the market to buy one, you're not just making it with those materials. It's now sort of wrapped in my skin. It's wrapped in my identity. And that means I'm an input to the productivity of that product that you're sending back to me. And so while I'm not worth the whole market value of that product, I am worth a micro value of that product. And I want my piece because I'm owed it, because it is efficient, because it is morally right. And so we look at the GDPR as a moral issue and a moral win. And so now we'll build on it. So this is just one step in a long process that we have to ride out, for lack of better phrases. So we're going to ride it out,
All right.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a really fascinating view. So thank you very much for
Thank you.
coming here and sharing that with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.